Xi Jinping is doing a military parade in Beijing. This is culminating with the SEO summit. So as you see all these different Chinese vehicles being brought around on the backs of trucks, all these different missiles and helicopters and different types of long-range drones and UAVs, all these soldiers marching, and of course Beijing's finest Xi Jinping standing up, looking and observing the different military formations as he goes down in his beautiful limo. This is not just a show of force for the Chinese. This is culminating with a diplomatic show of force. This is a physical show of force. This is what you would call a kinetic show of force, as Chinese soldiers yell different slogans and they do the march and do the whole shebang. You're going through with this. As that's happening, there is meetings between Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin of Russia, and Narendra Modi. Now, it is not just Xi Jinping, Modi, and gang, and Vladimir Putin. There's also others, because this is an SEO meeting. So the SEO is an organization of states that includes Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, China, Russia, now recently Belarus, Iran, Pakistan. There's a lot of countries that are included, but it roughly ends up being 40% of the world's population, if when you include India, and again, a more recent member, and it includes 23 to 24% of the world's economy, GDP. And while this isn't an organization that is inherently anti-American, this is an organization that has for a long time been dominated by members who want to see an end to unipolarity, and they want multipolarity. The idea that America would not be the one that concentrates so much power under it. A lot of this power would end up being concentrated at different poles around the world. Beijing, of course, Moscow, you name it. So that's the purpose of the organization, is to coordinate communication between these states, cooperation, and trying to advocate for, I don't want to say the words New World Order, because I hear CNN say it. I hear all these mainstream outlets say New World Order. They're making a New World Order. And I immediately kind of like cringe a little bit. I kind of take a step back like, ugh. Oh, I don't know about that. I don't know about that, because of the image people make in their mind. But they do want a new standard for world affairs. They do want the power to be more evenly distributed, because the more power that the United States loses, the more power the United States, people who are staring down the United States in different conflicts, whether it be Russia and Ukraine and Europe, whether it be China and in the Indo-Pacific and Taiwan, or whether it be India on any other different agreements that they could have with the United States, they would be able to throw around more weight as we would throw around less. There's also a question of certain standards that they don't want to abide by. China believes Taiwan is theirs, and whatever international standard that could be set, they don't abide by it if it says that Taiwan is not theirs. Russia, of course, has the same feeling about Ukraine, and a lot about some of the international standards that have been set for the crime of aggression, and when Russia can and can't attack, and the rights of nation states to govern their own affairs. Do they really have that right if they're in your backyard? And so there's different motivations, some of them fair when it comes to how and why these rules were written in the way they were, not for these nations included, and other times that are not fair. Like, I want to invade Taiwan. I want to invade Ukraine. I don't want to have to abide by international standards that everybody else abides by, and I abided by and signed, like how Russia did when it comes to abiding by the standards when it comes to the deportation of children from war zones, which they illegally trafficked children out of Ukraine into Russia, and continue to refuse to return many of those children home to the Ukrainians. They signed agreements agreeing not to do that. There's been a bunch of other instances of behavior where the Russians have done things that they have agreed not to do. And of course, that isn't very fair. But the fact of the matter is that China and Russia, and even India to some extent, all have motivations to make the world order, in their view, more multipolar, or at the very least, less Western centric. And so they get together at the SEO. They have this meeting, and it isn't just Putin, Xi, and Modi. There are other leaders there as well, including North Korea's Kim Jong-un, who arrived in Beijing from a train that came from Pyongyang all the way out to Beijing in order to be there for the military parade. And then when these people meet up, you can see they're not measured. You know, they say Xi's measured smile, he's somewhat, but Modi isn't. Modi walked up to Xi and the rest of the gang, literally holding Vladimir Putin's hand while walking to meet with the rest of these world leaders. And meetings between these three, Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi, and Xi Jinping, are not very common. And it wasn't just Modi that joined hands with Xi and Putin, but later, Xi and Putin stood shoulder to shoulder. They all like gave speeches. They all made big, statements and such. I'm not speeches, but like official statements. And then the meeting between Modi and Xi, as they shook hands and they talked, is particularly interesting considering India and China have many longstanding disputes, including territorial disputes on the border that have broken out in wars in the past, and in recent years have even gotten deadly, with different soldiers literally beating each other to death with sticks and stones on the border due to disarmament treaties about those border patrols. And Putin and Xi, Putin and Modi probably had the most in-depth, or I would say personal conversation. And I would say that because Modi and Putin got in the limo and drove around and talked one-on-one for an hour. One-on-one, deep conversation. So these are people planning the future of world geopolitics right now, with the United States not at the table. These are the people planning the future of geopolitics right now, with Europe not at the table, and with many other nations not at the table, many nations in Africa, many nations elsewhere. But it makes sense. This is for Southeast Asia. Now it has expanded to include Belarus. This region, when you look at the SEO and look at the nation, it's expanded much further than where it used to be. But at the end of the day, they're trying to set up a new system of affairs. And in some ways, their critiques are valid. And I've had these disagreements before. When you have a nation state like Israel that can continue to occupy the Golan Heights or other territories with no repute from those who most hold up the international system, it makes it look hypocritical, and therefore it makes it weaker, not only in the eyes of leaders, but in some ways, more importantly, in the eyes of the people. And so I think there are some critiques of the international system in making it more inclusive that are fair. But China, I don't really think necessarily wants an international system that's fair. They want an international system that's fair to what they want, i.e., when an international body mediates between China and the Philippines, and they say, hey, the Scarborough Shoal where, Filipino fishermen have been using to fish off for years, this is internationally recognized Filipino territory. And off of these old maps you given, that's just not enough. China, it's Filipino territory. They just ignore the decision. They'll agree to abide by a decision of a third-party mediator, and then will reject it once the decision does not go their way. Many of the reasons that they have motivations to change the system is because then they can be more forceful in Asia. For example, in Taiwan. When it goes to the Russians, that's pretty self-evident. Part of the reason they don't want these structures in place is because they want to redraw the territorial boundaries of Europe. They want to expand. They want their backyard to grow and to grow and to grow. Because if their backyard's greater, they can complain over a greater slough of territory and people. For the Indians, that's where it gets interesting. See, India, out of Russia and China, has the least amount of reasons to be confrontational with the United States. We don't deny any territorial claims that they make, that they're making some territorial claim that we're denying them. India is the largest democracy on the planet, despite Narendra Modi's authoritarian tendencies. It is still a democracy. And so that's another similarity between the United States and India. The United States and India has engaged in fruitful trade for many years. And the United States and India has worked together on anti-terrorism operations. We have never fought a war with India, and we have not often found ourselves starkly on the other side of another conflict with India, unless sometimes it's like through a third party where they're kind of with this team, we're with the other team, but it's not, there's nothing direct. There's never been American and Indian soldiers fighting against each other in arm to arm combat. In fact, the most recent instances I can think of would maybe be the First and Second World War, where it wouldn't be that crazy to actually see an Indian and American soldier fighting hand in hand, considering they were part of British colonialism at that point, and many of their men fought bravely against Nazi expansionism in Europe. So there's not a lot of historical precedent for America and India to face off too much, but India's always had this kind of non-aligned position, being able to balance in between world powers while asserting for its national security. And this has been India's kind of position for a pretty long time. And they don't really seem to be moving off of it. The one concern I have is Donald Trump. Is that if some people might be like, look, and some Indians might think, look, even if we have some problems with the American system, America could be viewed by some as a declining power. How much that is true, I don't know. But under that assumption, even if you have problems with the United States, you could just wait them out, continue to do trade with them, and hope that, you know, we kind of peacefully transition. And on the way down, the United States doesn't put up some struggle where it starts applying its like unreasonable standards on other nations, XYZ. But if you have someone like Donald Trump who could create a crisis, if you have someone like Donald Trump who will certainly not go down or readjust into a new position that might not be as favorable to the United States peacefully, despite Trump's assumingly anti-war, anti-globalist marketing, he still very much wants to benefit from the United States holding positions like, hey, this guy who we don't like is wanted by international courts, sanction them, bounties, we'll support the efforts against them. Oh, this organization wants to investigate our soldiers, never mind. Trump still wants to hold that double standard. He very much still wants to hold that double standard. I mean, people forget, but Donald Trump's ambassadors to the UN included Nikki Haley and John Bolton. So Donald Trump places a 50% tariff on India. Mind you, that 50% tariff on India is 20% higher than the 30% tariff that was placed on the Chinese. China is also a country that is buying Russian energy. China and India are buying boatloads of Russian energy. Without China and India, but also China, Russia would not be able to fund the war. So, if China and India are both funding Russia, why is it just that India gets the 50% tariff and not China? Now, the 50% tariff on Indian businesses is going to hurt. It is going to hurt Indian manufacturers who want to sell to one of the biggest consumer bases on the planet and one of the wealthiest consumer bases on the planet in the United States. But so far, the Indians have not backed down. And the calling out of hypocrisy of why is it that we get the 50% tariff, but they don't get the 50% tariff is something that is pretty popular online when looking at Indians and how they're reacting to the tariff. And they're reacting to it very negatively. So I have to ask, if there's not a consistent standard with these tariffs, and Trump isn't doing the legwork to get them to concede to these tariffs, but are just putting them in place, is there any fear that you could end up pushing all these nations together to work against the United States? Because some of them might be getting pressured for valid reasons, but some of them are getting pressured for invalid reasons. Then you end up pushing them together to work against us. And then India has no reason to disengage with Russian energy export because they don't want its foreign policy controlled in this manner, or certainly controlled in an inconsistent manner where the Trump administration is not even making itself particularly clear that it even cares about Ukraine. But now all of a sudden they're supposed to stop buying Russian energy exports because of a 50% tariff, despite how cheap it is. Look, all I'm saying is that if this is not done with some intelligence, if this is not done in a way That it's one thing for China and Russia to be pushed together, but if you push all three of these nations together, it's going to be a lot harder. If you could stop Chinese exports to Russia, but Indian exports continued, that already would be a massive blow. Or vice versa. If you were able to stop Indian exports, but Chinese exports were to continue, that would also be a massive blow. But if the end result is you didn't stop either export, you've actually stopped them from selling more things to the United States, you've worsened their relationship, and you've actually pushed them all together, well, then you haven't really achieved anything, have you? You certainly haven't put any more pressure on the Russian war machine. You certainly haven't taken pressure off of the Ukrainians, and you haven't brought the Russians to the table to negotiate. If anything, the Russians might even come to the table to negotiate in a stronger position, or at least thinking they're in a stronger position, because they think, hey, they tried to throw tariffs at the Indians, and the Indians didn't budge. We're in a stronger position. Before, it was an unknown of whether or not Trump could pull these levers and make the Indians, buckle. Now we know that they won't. Anyway, point is, I don't think that there's a Nobel Peace Prize around the corner on these tariffs. And I think the reaction from them so far, when it comes to not buying Russian energy, we've seen no movement. When it comes to meeting and closer relationships with these other countries, we have seen movement. Now, whether or not this just ends up being symbolic, a lot of the times the critiques after these meetings is that most of the BRICS talk is symbolic, that a lot of these countries have interests that diverge, where if you're India and China, you have territorial disputes. If you're Russia and India, you're not going to agree 100% on sanctions because the Indians do want to do business with the United States. They're a growing economy. They want to grow, and having access to American capital would be very useful for that. Other countries like Pakistan have diverging interests. Other countries have diverging interests. Hell, a decade or two ago, you could even say Belarus might even have diverging interests. Now it's a little bit more difficult. Point is, though, because they had diverging interests, when somebody comes forward and says, hey, we want a BRICS currency, the problem is Russia will say, okay, let's make it the ruble because they want the ruble to be strong. And everybody else will say no because the ruble's weak and they don't trust it. The Chinese don't want it to be their currency, but even if it was, it'd be terrible because it's more subject to political controls than, say, the Federal Reserve is, which is part of the reason why America currently is the Federal Reserve currency. And they can't get around another alternative. They've never been able to agree on an alternative because not even everybody agrees that there should be a competitor to the US dollar. And so these countries might all agree that the rest of the world should have more influence. They should be speaking at the table, but they all don't necessarily agree about the way on how to go about it, or exactly how far it should go, or if it should cover things like reserve currency status in the first place. So when it comes to organizations like the SEO, yes, they're having meetings. Yes, they're having behind the rooms talk. Modi's talking to Putin in the limo. Yes, they look very friendly in public. Yes, they're posing for the cameras. Yes, the military parades are happening and Xi Jinping is passing rows and rows of Chinese soldiers and trucks carrying long-range UAVs, missiles, and tanks and such. But at the end of the day, it's one thing to talk the talk. It's another thing to walk the walk. And just like BRICS, until we see the SEO take that 40% of the world's population, take that 22 to 23 to 24% of world GDP, and swing it around towards a goal that they can agree on, it's a club for the leadership of countries that want more influence in the current power order. But I mean, so do many countries. That doesn't mean they all agree on how to get it or who should be where once you figure it out. I will say, though, one signal we can take after the meeting is that Vladimir Putin did say, after meeting with Xi and Modi, where Modi, you could expect that for an hour with Modi, Trump institutes 50% 50% tariffs on the Indians in order to get them to stop buying Russian energy imports. Putin then meets with Modi, speaks to him for an hour in a limo, then talks with Xi Jinping, then goes in public and says NATO enlargement has to be addressed for there to truly be peace in Ukraine, or presumably, of course, he would continue the invasions, the bombings, and the occupation. So, if anything, I do think that this meeting has Putin feeling bullish. Putin does not feel right now quite reserved. He doesn't feel that he needs to pull back. I think he feels that he needs to lean in. That right now, the United States is dividing the Western alliance behind Ukraine. The United States support for Ukraine is not consistent. It is not large. It has been reeled in. And the support that is being sent is touch and go. Sometimes it's frozen. Sometimes it's frozen by people under Trump that Trump didn't even know were making these decisions. And it seems that Donald Trump does not want to, at least after 8 months going on 9, bring to bear real consequences. Now, look, some might say with the tariffs being declared some amount of, illegal by the courts, that you're not allowed to just unilaterally declare and change tax policy, which makes sense constitutionally. A country created on no taxation without representation wouldn't just allow the president to unilaterally declare everything an emergency and just change tax policy. But even with that off the table, again, Lindsey Graham and these different Senate Democrats, they would all be more than happy to pass a sanctions bill on the Russians. The House would also be more than happy to pass a sanctions bill. All Trump has to do is say, go ahead. And he chooses not to. Until he brings upon a real consequence that the Indians and the Chinese and the Russians can't think, well, maybe Trump will wake up on the other side of the bed tomorrow. We'll be able to call him, and we can leverage our personal relationships, which Trump has talked about many times in both his book, Art of the Deal, and publicly, how much he values those personal relationships. But without Trump being in the figure, with it being Congress, it will look less flexible. The only problem is that Congress also made an exemption, which was demanded by the White House and by certain Trump fanatics, that Trump can apply and unapply it like a tool in his tool belt. So it would have more finality to it, yes, but it would still have a certain amount of flexibility that gives me concern. Gives me concern that they're just going to wait until eventually he reels it in. Either way, though, it's better than just waiting and seeing and hoping that the same failed policies that haven't worked yet are going to work in the future. Xi Jinping